Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
This is the state of affairs, and I'm Akshay. Let's go.
The public sector in India, perhaps everywhere in the world too, is the private sector of those in public office.
How do you assess the Indian state's role in our growth story since independence?
Until 1991, we were a disaster. We produced bread. There was a modern bread factory. We produced and perhaps continue to produce soap. Mysore sandal is still, I think, produced by the government undertaking.
So could you, for the benefit of the layman, explain what exactly is the state's role in the economic growth of a country?
It's a seemingly simple question, Akshit, but I think a good question. Let's say, take the past 100 years or so, since 1917, the Soviet Revolution. The belief, fueled by a lot of literature, Marx, Engels, and many others, was that state should be the center of the universe, even in economic activity. We know pretty well now that led to disaster. Every single country that followed that model underperformed, some collapsed, and the people of those countries or peoples of those countries are still continuing to pay a very heavy price. But at the same time, unbridled economic freedom without state doing its duty also doesn't really help societies. If today capitalism flourished, it's because that capitalism is now moderated by a deeper understanding of what the state's role is in promoting economic activity, in enhancing productivity, and in giving a fair deal to the bulk of the people. Because these are the three critical things. Promote economic activity and give opportunity to the bulk of the people, a fair deal to the bulk of the people, and enhance productivity. Let us take each of these elements. I think the first condition is the state will not unnecessarily intervene in economic activity, allow freedom in production, distribution. Because the basic premise being if multiple players are there, producers and buyers, if there is a free and fair competition, then everybody benefits. And that's a fundamentally valid proposition. So except to the extent that you create a level playing field, and that's what rule of law is about in the economic sense, and also to protect the society at large, because there's a possibility that enterprise may flourish, a producer may flourish. Either the consumer or the larger society may lose. Pollution is a good example. Sometimes even if there's no direct harm, the harm can be societal. Supposing you have inefficient machines, guzzling energy, even if the producer and consumer are happy for the time being, it's not good for the society at large. Therefore, the social cost must not be allowed to be unsustainable. And you must protect the health and the well-being of the people at large. To that extent, definitely the state must play a role. Otherwise, I think the norm should be competition, fairness, and state staying away from that, provided there's a level playing field, and that means the rule of law. That is the first order. Without that, anyway, economic activity cannot flourish, because there are countries which are not socialist, but which are thoroughly useless as economies. Because there's no order in society. Without order, you cannot have economic activity. There's no predictability. There are no property rights. The fundamental rights are not respected. There's no judicial process. There's no due process. Everything is arbitrary. So that is the first order. The second order is enhancing productivity. Now, until about 1900, or perhaps even well into 1920s and 30s, most of the governments did not recognize, until about 1800, well into 1830s, 40s, most of the governments did not recognize the importance of education. I'm talking of Europe and America. Take, for instance, somebody like Abraham Lincoln. He was born in 1809. What was Lincoln's education? There was no state schooling. He had 2 years of church schooling. For the poor population, the local Christian church provided some schooling. Therefore, you had basic literacy and numeracy. Rest of it was self-educated. And Lincoln grew up in 1810s and 1820s. Only in 1830s and 40s, the capitalist societies, today's very progressive Western developed countries, they recognize the importance of education because they realize two things. One, unless quality education is given, there are no skills, and modern economy depends on skills. You can't dig a pit and fill a pit and create wealth. That was okay during agrarian era. And therefore, skills are necessary for the overall productivity. There's also another thing they recognized. If wealth passes on from generation to generation because of genes and because of family, not because of talent and hard work, then you have a problem. Eventually, there will be social schism. Society will not accept it. There cannot be peace and order in society. That was the feudal order. The feudal lord got the property and the serfs acted as serfs, and the feudal lord's first son, by the law of primogeniture, he got the property. That was okay in the feudal system. It simply is not a functional one in a capitalist system and a market economy. And therefore, on both grounds, productivity enhancement and giving opportunity depending on the talent and willingness to work hard. If you don't give people an option, an opportunity to rise, and that is quality education and skills, and eventually healthcare became another ingredient. That became only in the 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century. One of the reasons why Japan became such a famous, powerful Asian power was in Asia, or in fact outside of North America and Europe, Japan was the first country to embrace education. After major restoration, Japan gave education to practically everybody, on par with the best in the world. And that's why Japan prospered. So education and healthcare, in my judgment, are the most important ingredients in order to enhance human capability. In addition to the basic infrastructure, because without basic infrastructure, the collective goods, there is no way you can guarantee that economic growth takes place. Without national highways, without proper communication network, without power being available in plenty on demand, without water being available, and without 100 other infrastructural things are being available, economic growth cannot take place. So if the state takes care of those things well, then I think we've done okay. But if the state fails to do that, if the state fails to create a level playing field, a fair system of rule of law, if the state does not create the infrastructure, if the state does not give quality education and healthcare, at least at school level, basic level, after that, higher education, you can pay for it, you can have other mechanisms, but basic 10, 12 years of quality schooling and good quality healthcare, and if there is no rule of law, then economy will not grow. And anything more the state attempts, it will not be wise. But from time to time, the state also anticipates the future direction of the economy and therefore devotes some resources for research and development. For instance, solar power. Internet itself came from state support. Vaccine industry, new medicines. So in areas where the risk is very high, the cost of innovation is very high, and the potential profit could be very low or risky, then the state intervenes. That's why big bucks are spent by the governments in some countries in certain areas of research, not everything. And after that, the private sector can take it over. But for the basic things, if you don't create the framework, if there's no direct profit, an enterprise may not be willing to innovate. So, but that is as and when you have more resources. But definitely not producing what others can produce, the state should never produce. Definitely not deciding who is a favorite, deciding who should produce, it's none of your business, the market should decide. And definitely not even deciding what is the technology that should be one of the future. Again, while state will certainly play some role, it should be driven largely by the market forces, but the state will play some role. Take the transition from the old-fashioned fossil fuel energy to the new energy systems. The state in many countries, in India for instance, the state decided that hydrogen may be a wave of the future. I don't know if that's the case or not. In America, also, they are now tipping the scale. Some experts in the government are saying these are the future areas. Some people are seriously questioning it. Some other people are saying it's okay. I think only the future will tell us whether the judgment is right. But I would prefer if multiple options are considered by a group of outstanding experts who understand the field, and the government does not decide arbitrarily which is the one they want to promote, and then spread their resources in a manner that there's a realistic possibility of various options growing. For instance, the cellulosic biofuels in India, I think there is a possibility. For instance, the algal growth, how we utilize the algae, both for environmental reasons and for nutritional and fuel needs. Perhaps we can do some research. In addition to solar power and hydrogen cells, I would prefer that the state actually looks at a broader menu of options and gets the best expertise instead of politically deciding what is best for the country or the mankind. But otherwise, the state should scrupulously stay away.
So, in this context, how do you assess the Indian state's role in our growth story since independence?
Until 1991, we were a disaster. We produced bread. There was a modern bread factory. We produced and perhaps continue to produce soap. Mysore sandal is still, I think, produced by the government undertaking. The steel plant is very well known. At the time when Tatas and others wanted to actually expand, a government refused to give a license and they built these behemoths. And even now, many people argue that there was not enough money in the private hands and therefore the government had put in the capital. I think that's a disingenuous argument, developed subsequently. If private sector was willing to go into the field, you prevent them and then say you don't have money, therefore I will come in. I don't find it a very plausible argument. In every which way, I think we hurt ourselves very badly and we paid a heavy price. And I discovered that my generation, I was born in the 50s, second half of the 1950s, 56 I was born. My generation, we grew up as socialists without even knowing what socialism is. We were somehow led to believe that everything governmental is noble, everything private is suspect. My scales fell when I was a special officer of Visakhapatnam Steel Project, at that time India's largest public investment. 8,000 crores in those days. Those days, 8,000 crores was a lot of money. Trust me. Today, 8,000 crores is now like $1 billion is nothing. But in those days, it was an incredibly large amount of money. As I dug deep into the steel plant, the way things are handled, while there are good people, I realized that public sector in India, perhaps everywhere in the world too, is the private sector of those in public office. The word public should not seduce us into believing that it is for the public good. It is for the exercise of private power and patronage and arbitrary exercise of power by the individuals who happen to be in power. It is not for the public good. And I have that implacable faith even now that public sector as a general principle is bad in any sector, in any segment of economic activity. Then slowly, as my generation started understanding what was happening in the world, and luckily there was a big laboratory, or many laboratories in the world. The whole Soviet bloc versus the Western bloc, or specific countries with the same history, culture and civilization. South Korea versus North Korea, East Germany versus West Germany, Taiwan versus China. So the contrast could not have been greater. So if anybody, after seeing these mega experiments inadvertently played out in front of our eyes, if we still believe that the government control of economic activity is an answer to the problems, I just don't know what they're speaking. 1991 we started. In some areas we have done okay, but we haven't really pursued the principles of economic freedom and effective state soul in improving the economic lot of the people adequately. Agriculture still significantly suffers under the state control or weak policy. Labor laws still are a tremendous nuisance. That's why labor-intensive industries are not growing in a country where tens of millions of people are desperately in need of a secure wage-earning job. China, for instance, exports $323 billion of textiles and garments. We produce equal amount of cotton. We are 1/5 as poor as China. Our income per capita income is 1/5 of China's. And we have tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people in the unorganized sector. And we are only exporting $41 billion. The only reason is labor laws. And even today, the government is deciding the favorites. They are tipping the scales. The whole Adani or some other imbroglio, I forget the party politics. What is the basic issue? The moment government plays favorites, you're not allowing fair market competition. And that suspicion is real. How far it's verified by facts or not is a different issue. But the fact that the government is not able to erase that impression, whichever be the party, earlier Ambani's got that advantage. Yeah. During Congress regime, earlier somebody else got it. In states, we all know. So if the economic fortunes of individuals are decided by the government patronage or the lack of it, then we certainly are not functioning well. But most important of all, rule of law, education and healthcare, we are very, very deficient. Infrastructure is improving. We are still, by global standards, very poor, but definitely conscious efforts are being made since Vajpayee government's time to improve the infrastructure. A lot more needs to be done, but I think we are on the right track. So it's a mixed bag. We have a long way to go.
Thank you for your insights and your time, Dr. JP. I am Akshat, and this is the State of Affairs.